back on the Zero Hour. I, as always, am your host, Richard RJ Eskow, and I've been looking forward to talking to my next guest because I've been reading him for quite some time. Pepe Escobar is a correspondent for Asia Times Hong Kong. He is a writer and analyst for Consortium News here in the US and for Strategic Culture in Moscow. He is also the author of a new book, a collection of essays entitled Raging Twenties, Great Power Politics Meets Techno-Feudalism, right away from the subtitle there. You know, it's right up my alley. And without any further ado, Pepe Escobar, thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks, Richard. Great pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
Pleasure to have you, especially since I understand you're in Thailand, so the time difference is pretty key.
It's still early. 10:30 at night. It's I'm starting actually.
Yeah, in my corporate life, I had a boss who said, do you ever arrive in time for 7 a.m. meetings? And I said, I don't stay up that late, which is not the answer he was looking for. But that's why my corporate life is a failure all around. But let's talk about your new book, because as I read it, seems a lot of the essays may have been published independently, but as your subtitle suggests, there's an underlying theme that is obviously, in this case, influenced a great deal by the pandemic, by biosecurity issues and that sort of thing. So how close did I get in my sort of thumbnail summary of your theme there?
Yes, Richard, there are two major narratives that intersect, overlap, run in parallel. And these were the two major narratives in 2020. And they continue in 2021. One of them is great power politics, which is basically the US against the Russia-China strategic partnership. And the other important pole is Iran. Like, you know, in the introduction for the book, my first sentence, in fact, is that the Raging Twenties started with a murder. And that is a fact. January 3rd, the assassination of General Soleimani at Baghdad airport. Mm-hmm. So this was the actual start of the Raging Twenties. Started literally with lots of rage, actually. Yeah. And then, almost simultaneously, a matter of few days afterwards, that was the beginning of the SARS-CoV-2 tsunami, which has been engulfing us ever since, right? So it was interesting because my publisher asked me for a book about 2020. And I said, okay. When I start looking at the columns, like you said, they were published on Asia Times, Consortium News in DC, and Strategic Culture in Moscow. It was fascinating because chronologically, they were telling this story, you know, this parallel narratives. And if you read the book, it's great that you follow chronologically because you see how the difference of approach towards the pandemic between the West and Asia is so glaring. And at the same time, you see the frictions between Washington and Beijing and Moscow getting fiercer and fiercer, you know. So in the end, I decided to edit the columns chronologically. And at the center of the book, there is an anchoring essay, which was never published before. I wrote it for a think tank in Asia. So it only appeared in a think tank journal, you know, so very few people read it, except academics. So this is the anchoring essay. It's titled Eurasia, the Hegemon, and the Three Sovereigns. The three sovereigns are Russia, China, and Iran. So this is the, let's say, the arc that organizes the great power politics narrative. And in terms of the pandemic, you see little by little the onset of this new normal, as they are trying to convince us, right? Which different declinations of the power of big tech, which is now converging into what I called it techno-feudalism, inspired by a book that unfortunately is not available in English yet. The term techno-feudalism was coined by an economist from the Sorbonne in Paris. And his book is called Techno-feudalisme in French, techno-feudalism in English. And one of the essays, it's actually very important. I try to explain to the English-speaking world the importance of this book and how come that nobody in the US or in the UK wrote such a book, you know. So then the idea is for the reader to have an eagle's eye view of the year 2020, our annus mirabilis, right? And following these two narratives that are crisscrossed all the time.
So one of the things I appreciate about that, Pepe Escobar, is that well, first of all, as a culture in the West, I think it's kind of an understatement to say we're not the best at systemic thinking, right? We don't.
Oh, definitely not.
And the United States certainly proved that in 2020. And just in a short piece, for example, when they were in Trump and others were calling it the China virus, I called it the capitalism virus, not just to be a lefty agitator, because if you look at the vectors of transmission, they were actually business people going from China to the West, to Europe, London, New York, and to the United States. But of course, they might demonize Asians, as we've seen tragically this week in the United States play out, but they would never demonize the global system that really spread this disease. And what I appreciate about your viewpoint about it, number one, is that it's not a US centric as so much, not just American, but even some European reporting can be, I think, but that it shows that this is playing out, at least this is my takeaway, one of my takeaways, that it shows that it's playing out against this matrix of political and economic forces, and that in a way, and I've thought this before, that the pandemic, in a sense, can serve as an X-ray of the global system that is shown this bright radiation through it, and we see the bones and the muscle and the nerves and the sinew. I don't know if that analogy resonates for you, but in a sense, I think that's part of what you were doing in these essays here. What do you think?
Yes, it's correct, Richard. The point of view of this book, of course, it's not US-centric because, of course, I lived in the US in both coasts in the past. I've been going to the West since I was a teenager. I know the country pretty well. I've been to probably 40 states on the road, which is the only way to understand America, right. To be on the road and to talk to people, right? But I live between East and West, but I live between Europe and Asia. My base used to be London, and for the past few years is Paris in Europe. And my base in Asia used to be Hong Kong, and for the past few years is Bangkok. So because I go back and forth, obviously before COVID, I've been stranded here for 1 year, like a lot of expats all across the world, right?
Sure.
I could compare both approaches. In fact, I would say the very smug European approach that we have all the answers, and look what's going on in Europe as we speak. Right. New lockdowns in France, new lockdowns in Italy, new lockdowns in the UK, you name it, right? And of course, the Confucianist, Taoist, let's put it this way, approach all around here in East Asia, including where I am in Thailand, which is one of the most successful nations in the world in terms of fighting COVID-19. There were like 60-something deaths. That's all. That's all for over a year. Vietnam, 0 death.
Right.
Zero. You know, our neighbors. You know, and China, of course, because the whole thing started in Wuhan. It's very hard to explain to people in the West why their lockdown and their controls worked. It's a number of reasons.
Right.
because it was targeted, because it was ultra professional, because they spared no expense, building hospitals and contacting the best medical know-how, not only in China but all over the world, knowing how to isolate people, using tracking to control the spread of the disease. Of course, their initial lockdown in Wuhan was extremely drastic. This is something that we cannot even imagine in a major developed economy in the West. But it worked, and they had don't forget that they had experience from SARS in the past. So they learned, they applied that, they tried everything in terms of trying some sort of remedy in the beginning when they didn't know how the virus actually worked. Yeah. So they tried everything, vitamin D, vitamin C, right. Orange juice, you name it, everything. So it was trial and error. They kept perfecting it. And after a while, it worked because they prevented the spread of people who were contaminated from Hubei province to other provinces. Can you imagine if you had an initial breakdown in Shanghai, for instance? It would be a catastrophe,
right.
Total catastrophe. Or Beijing, they managed to do that. So why does it work? Because it's a different cultural mentality. So culture explains everything. They obey orders. It's internalized the fact that the government is really looking after their health, and there are no ulterior motives. And at least for the public inside China, the Chinese government was very effective into disseminating their message. You have to do this because it's good for you. So that's it. If you live in a compound, you cannot go out. You want to order food, the people who take care of the reception will collect your food and bring it to your apartment. This is how it works. You cannot go out, even if you have a stamp, It worked in the beginning, but in the West, you cannot implement things like that. You know that.
And what's interesting, and again, we're talking with Pepe Escobar, whose new book is Raging Twenties. What's interesting to me about that, Pepe, is that, you contrast one of the narratives here in the U.S. is, well, China's a totalitarian socialist state, so they just order people to, freeze in place and they have to do it, or they go to the gulag. That's a kind of mythology. But Thailand, by contrast, is, if anything, not only a capitalist economy, but technically a monarchy, and you still have laws of lèse-majesté there and so on. So clearly that's not the case in Thailand, right? So it seems to me, I'm wondering if what we're seeing is, among other things, a kind of bio-feudalism that says, the Western European history of feudal rule kind of lingers in that culture. The U.S. mythology of the Wild West individualist, loner with a gun is dominant here. And I'm wondering if what we're seeing is, whenever I see collective action being successful, my background, my first reflex is, well, that's kind of a proto-socialism, but I wonder if this isn't something different than that this is just we're dealing with cultures that are more accepting of communal requirements and communal needs, whereas for Great Britain, Margaret Thatcher said, there is no we, there's only the individual, there is no society, the ultimate Ayn Randian atavistic view of the world. So I'm wondering, whether that's what we're really seeing, which is one culture that says, wow, we're all in this for ourselves, and why should I wear a mask to help you? I don't even believe your problems are my problems, even when you're coughing in my face. And a culture that is somehow more, I don't want to stereotype either, but somehow more conducive to collaboration. I wonder if economics maybe has nothing to do with it.
You're right. Ayn Rand doesn't travel well in East Asia, for starters. Confucius does. Right. Lao Tzu does. The Buddha does. Right. It's a completely different mindset, which implies attention to the other, attention to the elderly and caring for the elderly, like, because COVID-19, the elderly are extremely vulnerable. They had extra care everywhere. Here in Thailand was a typical case. We had a very strict lockdown for 2 months. Like in my case, the only thing I was allowed to do is to go to the mini mall, buy my dinner, and come back, and that's it. This applied to everybody. And it worked. In Vietnam, it was not a strict lockdown, but it was under strict vigilance and control and testing. They were testing everybody. They tested probably the whole country. So this is all. It's a cultural shock, absolutely, between this extreme individualism of the West, especially in the US, unbridled individualism, and in Europe with a sort of, let's say, a veneer of the Enlightenment in terms of our values are, the supreme values for the whole of mankind. Yes, but you cannot deal with a pandemic.
Right. No, we're absolutely incapable of it. And
incapable.
and Pepe, what's fascinating to me about this is that as you describe the way it's working in Asia, I think back to what may be the only time in history that the United States experienced that kind of collective response, which was in the 1930s with the response to the Depression and the WPA and people being put back to work on government programs. And then the 1940s and World War II, my mother used to speak so nostalgically of those times and how, during World War II, she had one of those Rosie the Riveter jobs, but she was, picking up garbage at the Kaiser aluminum factory. My dad was going to college during the day and building ships with, welding at night. And, my mom described his glasses all pitted, how romantic he looked. And then he went off to war. That to me it didn't work out for them, but that's another story. but that to me is the only time I can think of when Americans felt a sense of common purpose, and there were dissidents and so on. But it seems to me it's a terrible loss, actually, that it leaves a vacuum in human existence.
It is, and it's a pity. For a foreigner, the most extraordinary thing in America, it's the people. Apart from the geological marvels that we know very well. But, this American melting pot and, the way people are really intrinsically good,
right.
It's wonderful. It captivates you. It's something that I come from 2 European families. In Europe, it's not like that. In Europe, they still have a medieval mentality. They still have a mentality of the principality here fighting the principality across the hills on the other side. It's terrible. You don't see this in America, or at least in the old America doesn't exist anymore, right? But in Asia, the great thing is this communal spirit. Here, for instance, there are a lot of problems with Thailand. It's a pyramid society, the monarchy on top. You cannot even criticize them. But the fact that you respect order and you see that what is designed is for your own good and everybody respects it, it works. In China, it's the same thing. It doesn't matter if it's the Ming dynasty or the Chinese Communist Party. It doesn't matter. This is the Confucius mentality. Let's work for the common good and let's respect the rules. So if you have exception rules in the case of a pandemic, everybody respects it. I'll give you a simple example. Even in Hong Kong, which is very westernized, as you all know, everyone who lives in Hong Kong, if you went out in the street and you look around and you see people who are not wearing a mask, it's because they were not Hong Kongers. You see, everybody understands, okay, we need this and let's do it. It's normal. Here's the same thing. You don't see a single Thai without a mask in any circumstances, So it's something very simple. It's not going to kill you if you wear a mask. It's no
Right,
big
of
deal.
course. Yeah.
It's a matter of respect to the other.
Yes, no question about it. And the only place in Europe where I can recall anything like that psychology was Zurich, the Swiss.
Zurich, yeah.
I once made committed the cardinal sin of, I think, crossing over the white line while we were waiting for a trolley in Zurich, and I got scolded by 15.
You got scolded by everybody, of course.
And my grandmother was French Swiss, so I got scolded by her a lot. But again, we're talking to Pepe Escobar. Pepe, let me ask you, why do you call your book, and why do you call the decade the Raging Twenties? There are many things they are. Raging is not a bad descriptor, certainly, but what was your thinking in that phrase?
Well, it was a pun with the Roaring Twenties, of course.
For sure.
And the fact that it started with the assassination of Soleimani. And I'm sure you remember the first few months, the degree of animosity against China.
Oh, of course.
For an immense number of reasons, not only the pandemic, but the trade war, the mirror declinations of the trade war, the fact that China is stealing our lunch, you name it.
Right, absolutely.
So it started under the sign of rage, and people getting angrier and angrier. And when the lockdown started, people got even angrier, because there, especially across the West, there were myriad revolts against the lockdowns, or against wearing masks, right, or against the inefficiency of their own governments, or against the Chinese, which were once again, no, this is a Chinese virus, you name it. So I think it was and compared to Asia, where anger is considered one of the lowest forms that you can manifest your being, your behavior. Anger is dismissed as people on a higher level don't manifest anger in public. And this now is I would say, is the state of things all across the West, in the US, in most parts of Europe, in parts of South America. I think especially in Brazil, where Brazil has a president it's an international disgrace.
Of course, absolutely.
Beyond a disgrace, in fact. In a little over 2 years, he managed the complete destruction of a nation that a few years ago was the 6th largest economy in the world. This is no mean feat, right?
Yeah.
So anger
and also is destroying the rainforest that provides oxygen for the entire
Of course, with all those hidden interests, agribusinesses, multinational companies, of course, and the military who want to, kill all those Indians, in these reservations. It's an absolute horror story. So, and in the U.S., you know better than anyone what happened. the war between the wokes and the deplorables, which is corroding the nation, right? The fabric of the nation. And in Western Europe, the fact that the middle class in Western Europe is also disappearing, not as fast as in the US, but the middle class in Spain, France, Italy, UK, etc., is also completely shattered. The only thing that they have is, at least they have their pensions. That's their meaningful pensions.
And in the UK, the NHS, which they're working to erode as quickly.
Oh, used to be the best NHS in the world.
I know
that. You know that, huh?
Exactly. in London, and I was astonished at the. Coming from America to London, and it's taken care of. What do you mean it's taken care of? I think I have to wire my parents for money. No,
it's free.
But I'm not British. We don't care. We take care of it.
Exactly.
Today, and of course, you have in Germany, you have the rise of the AfD, and you have this kind of global. And I see the reflection of this, a response to this in your writing as well. You have this global Uprising, they use populist as an epithet, right? When
Right.
populist can be a left movement, it could be a social justice movement. To me, when they use populist as an epithet, they're really scorning democracy in one sense.
Absolutely.
But what they've done is shut off the channels for left populism. So what bubbles up instead is, to me, is this surge of dissatisfaction against the global economic system. I've had this debate here with Democrats in Washington, where I've had them say to me in the 2016 election, voters don't know about the trade agreements and that sort of thing. And I say, go to my original hometown, Utica, New York, sort of empty industrial, destroyed industrial city. Go to Michigan. You will see lawn signs against the TPP.
Against the TPP, yeah.
Right. They know, and they've been given no channel to reject that. So some of them, a subset of them, perhaps white, perhaps rural, whatever, react with the channel they've been given because they have a rage, and speaking of the Raging 20s, and it needs a home. And to me, it seems like what's implicit in your writing is this system that generates that rage, a recognition of that system. Mm-hmm. So if that's correct, then I'm wondering, what is the message we need to amplify, those of us who see a global systemic problem, to people who are drawn to the AfD in Germany? Because I don't reject any human beings, right? I think, except the worst of the worst, I think most people are just misinformed and frustrated. And so what do we say to the AfD types, to the Boris Johnson supporters, to the Marie Le Pen supporters, and so on? So I don't know. What are your thoughts on that? I don't think they're just deplorables. I think they're people who don't, have anyone speaking a language they can understand. But I'm very interested in your thoughts on that.
They're not deplorables at all, because most of these people, they are working class.
Right.
They are lower middle class, working class, the traditional proletariat. You remember, according to our old Marxist terminology, which still applies. They are proletariat. They live in peripheries of big cities, very precarious, small salaries for a family. They have sometimes 2 or 3 jobs or odd jobs to sustain their families. They have no political voice whatsoever. So what happened to the populist right in all these nations? We have this huge untapped audience. Let's talk to them. This is what Marine Le Pen started doing in France, for instance. Okay, let's not get into their platform. What I'm getting at is that she was clever enough to understand that there was this enormous audience of people that were completely marginalized from politics, and she could address their problems. Better salaries, working hours, political representation, against the elites, the 0.01% in France or in Italy or in Germany or in the UK, etc. So, and obviously the left didn't have an answer, because the left all over the West is committed to identity politics. That's
amen.
Huge strategic mistake. An enormous strategic mistake. No wonder the left is being battered all over, because they are talking to the established middle class or the upper middle classes, which a lot of these people, in fact, they don't even care about politics. They certainly don't care about inequality. They want to get rich quick, many of them. So this is the audience, the main audience for the Democrats in the U.S., for instance,
right?
Or for the different strands of the French center left, including Macron.
Absolutely.
Macron in France, he's a ghost. In fact, he's a banker's guy who was manufactured out of nothing, and he governs for the 0.01%. And the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests in France, they noticed that from the beginning.
Right.
It was wonderful. When I was still in Europe before COVID, I was traveling in Brittany or in Bourgogne, for instance. I always stopped to talk to yellow vests. They were usually in those roundabouts,
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
And they are the excluded from the French banquet. They work over 40 hours a week. So many of them, they need 2 or 3 jobs, horribly paid. They live in the equivalent of French favelas, in the periphery.
Absolutely. Yeah. The banlieues or whatever.
Exactly. In the banlieue, very heavy banlieues, some of them extremely dangerous and violent as well.
Yes, I know. Yeah.
Exactly. And obviously with no political representation whatsoever. So they say, look, for the moment we are disorganized. We don't want to organize ourselves into a political party. But maybe later it will be the only way out. Otherwise, we'll never have a voice in the Assemblée, in the French Parliament in Paris, which is true. There was nobody defending the yellow vests in the French Parliament. And the media was against it because the media is controlled by, obviously, oligarchs. But the population at large expressed huge sympathy because they knew that from a day to another, they could plunge in the social scale. And if they are unemployed, they will be unemployed forever under those circumstances. And their lives will be even worse and more hardcore than the lives of most yellow vests. And obviously, the number one thing, nobody on the left and nobody on the right was speaking for them. They had no political voice. And this was the most important grassroots political movement that happened in Europe for the past few years, if not decades.
And, I couldn't agree more. And I'm very curious to know what will happen if once the pandemic is lifted in terms of that. And I think that parenthetically, I think if the global financial elite could manifest itself in spirit form as a being, it would be Macron. To me,
very good.
It's the embodiment of the arrogance, the elitism, the pretensions to imperial grandeur. You name it. I think that guy is it. So I've always had a kind spot for the Gilets jaunes, and certainly understood their frustrations as their government starts examining, for example, undercutting the one thing a lot of working people have in France, which is their pensions.
Their pensions.
Yeah. So, but unfortunately, Pepe Escobar, at some point we will run out of time, you and I.
Oh, that's a pity.
Yes, I know. So what else would you like our viewers and listeners to know? I mean, your book is extremely informative. I really encourage
Thank you.
Everyone.
Well, if I had one message, pay attention to what's going on between Russia and China. The Russia-China strategic partnership at all levels, not only military, but in terms of flow of information, banking, finance, how they are merging that idea of integration of Eurasia, which is Putin years ago defined from Lisbon to Vladivostok. And it's true. Now it's from Lisbon to Shanghai and also Vladivostok. How they are organizing, it's a long-term process, but it's the most important social, political, trade, investment, development in the 21st century. And compare to the dissolution and the corrosion across the industrialized West. I'm sure you're going to draw some very interesting conclusions if you start paying attention and making these comparisons.
Given what I think is the inevitable decline of the American empire, sometimes I feel like I'm living in Britain circa 1934 or something.
1934, yeah.
And I get that from your writing as well. So Pepe, my guest
Thank you.
Pepe Escobar, his book again is Raging Twenties, Great Power Politics Meets Techno Feudalism. So thanks for writing it. I'm finding it very informative. And thanks for coming on the program.
Thanks very much, Richard. It was a real pleasure. Thanks a lot. Thanks,
you.
everybody.
And I hope you'll come back. And we'll be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.